September 17th, 1944, 2:14 p.m. Third Army Headquarters, Nancy, France. Major Richard Thornton Price of the British Army stood stiffly in General George Patton's office. His khaki uniform was flawless, sharply pressed, his Sam Browne belt polished, his clipboard held at the exact angle required by regulations. He was 34 years old, educated at Oxford, fluent in French and German, and had been personally chosen by Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery to act as liaison officer with Patton's Third Army. His assignment was to observe operational methods and evaluate logistical capacity. Within 48 hours, Patton would be pressing an ivory-handled Colt .45 against Thornton Price's forehead, shouting, "Get this British spy out of my headquarters before I forget we're allies and blow your goddamn brains all over my map room." The incident that sparked that eruption would reveal a chain of events leading directly back to Montgomery's headquarters and threaten to tear apart the Allied command structure itself. Before getting to what happened in that office, consider why this confrontation matters. It remains one of the most explosive episodes of the Second World War never fully recorded in the history books. The moment Patton realized his allies were interfering with his fuel supply and nearly triggered an international crisis by threatening to execute an Allied officer. Ask yourself, would you have stayed calm if you discovered your allies were undermining you, or would you have reacted the way Patton did? To understand how it came to this, we return to September 1944, when the Allied advance began to stall, and no one seemed able to explain why. By that point, Patton's Third Army had been advancing at a pace that defied conventional military expectations. After breaking out of Normandy in August, it had surged nearly 400 miles across France, liberated Paris, crossed the Moselle River, and positioned itself for a direct push into Germany, an advance that could potentially have ended the war before Christmas. Then, on September 15th, everything shifted. Patton's armored units began running out of fuel. Not slowly, but abruptly and disastrously, as though a valve had been shut off. On September 14th, Third Army received 32,000 gallons of gasoline. On September 15th, that number dropped to 7,000 gallons. On September 16th, they received nothing. Frontline units stalled on open roads, completely immobilized, vulnerable to German counterattacks, while Patton exploded at headquarters, demanding answers about the disappearance of his fuel. General Eisenhower's explanation was straightforward. Allied supply lines stretched from the beaches of Normandy to eastern France. Over 400 miles of damaged infrastructure, ruined roads, and destroyed bridges. Fuel stocks were limited, and not every army could be supported at the same time. Priorities had to be assigned. Montgomery's 21st Army Group was receiving precedence for Operation Market Garden, the airborne offensive into the Netherlands scheduled for September. Patton's forces, Eisenhower insisted, would have to wait and hold their positions until Market Garden succeeded. Patton rejected that explanation. His intelligence officers were tracking Allied fuel movements, and the figures didn't align. Fuel was reaching forward depots in quantities sufficient to support both operations. Yet Third Army's allocation continued to decline, while Montgomery's increased. Even though Market Garden required significantly less fuel than Patton's fast-moving armor formations. It was at this moment that Major Thornton Price arrived at Third Army headquarters, clipboard in hand, Oxford accent intact, carrying Montgomery's orders to observe operations. Patton's Chief of Staff, Major General Hobart Gay, conducted the initial briefing, outlining Third Army's deployments, objectives, and difficulties, including the unexplained fuel shortages crippling their advance. Price recorded everything carefully. He asked specific questions about fuel consumption rates, reserve quantities, and which units were suffering the most. Gay answered them as expected. Price was, after all, a liaison officer from Allied headquarters, simply performing his duties. At least, that's what they believed. That assumption collapsed on September 18th. At 3:40 hours, Captain Marcus Henderson, a signals intelligence officer, intercepted a British radio transmission. Henderson's official role was monitoring German communications, but he was also unofficially listening to British traffic. Patton never fully trusted the British and wanted to know what they discussed when American ears weren't meant to be listening. The transmission originated from 3rd Army Headquarters and was addressed to the headquarters of the 21st Army Group. Using frequencies and codes he was not authorized to access, Henderson decoded the message. It was a detailed report authored by Thornton Price. It outlined 3rd Army's exact fuel situation, reserve levels, daily consumption rates, and concluded that Patton's existing fuel stocks were adequate for defensive operations but insufficient for sustained offensive action. As a result, diverting additional fuel to Operation Market Garden would not significantly affect 3rd Army's capabilities. Henderson brought the intercept directly to General Gay at 6 o'clock hours. Gay immediately grasped the implications. Thornton Price had not merely been observing. He had been gathering intelligence on American fuel supplies and sending it directly to Montgomery. This allowed Montgomery to argue that Patton did not truly need additional fuel because, on paper, he already had enough. It was espionage disguised as liaison work, and it explained everything. Montgomery was using Thornton Price as a source of leverage. The reports he sent allowed Montgomery to argue to Eisenhower that Operation Market Garden deserved priority because Patton's 3rd Army was supposedly well supplied. In reality, Patton's forces were barely operating at all. They were running on fumes. And the only reason Montgomery knew their true fuel status was because his liaison officer was secretly transmitting American operational data. At 6:45 hours, Gay brought the intercepted message directly to Patton. According to several officers who were present in Patton's quarters that morning, the general's reaction was explosive. He read the decoded transmission once, then again, then a third time. His face flushed from pink to red, then to a deep purple. Finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Get Thornton Price to my office in 5 minutes." Then, after a pause, "And someone find my pistols. I'm going to need them." The officers in the room assumed he was joking. Generals didn't shoot liaison officers, even under extreme circumstances. But Patton didn't smile. He opened his footlocker, took out his ivory-handled Colt and his second pistol, checked both magazines, and methodically fastened his gun belt. There was nothing theatrical about it. The calm, deliberate precision made it clear he was not joking at all. Major Thornton Price arrived at Patton's office at 6:53 hours. He expected an ordinary morning briefing, perhaps more questions about supply procedures or operational planning. Instead, he found Patton standing behind his desk, both hands resting on his pistols. The general's pale blue eyes locked onto him with such intensity that Price stopped cold in the doorway. "Come in," Patton said quietly, "and close the door behind you. What I'm about to say stays in this room, unless you want the entire Allied command to learn that the British Army uses spies against its own allies." Thornton Price closed the door. The color drained from his face as he realized something had gone catastrophically wrong. Patton slid the decoded intercept across the desk. "Read it," Patton said. "Read your own words. Read how you reported American operational intelligence to Montgomery. Read your recommendation that fuel be diverted from my army based on false assessments of our capabilities. Then explain to me why I shouldn't treat you exactly as I would any enemy spy caught stealing military secrets." Thornton Price picked up the paper, his hands trembling. "General Patton," he began, "I was simply carrying out orders to submit liaison reports." Patton cut him off by drawing one pistol and placing it on the desk, the barrel pointed directly at the British officer. "Following orders," Patton repeated, his voice heavy with contempt. "That's what every spy says when he's caught. That's what every traitor claims when he's exposed. Here's what your orders have accomplished. My tanks are sitting empty on the roads. Montgomery convinced Eisenhower I didn't need fuel. And he convinced him because you've been feeding him intelligence about my supply situation, so he could argue for priority." Patton rose slowly, picked up the pistol, and walked around the desk until he stood directly in front of Thornton Price. so close that when he raised a weapon and pressed it against the officer's forehead, there was no chance of missing. "Give me one reason," Patton said, his voice still unnervingly calm. "One reason why I shouldn't blow your British brains all over my map room and tell Eisenhower you pulled a weapon on me. Who do you think he's going to believe, his most successful field commander or a dead spy?" The room fell completely silent, broken only by Thornton Price's rapid breathing and the ticking of the clock on the wall. According to Major General Gay, who witnessed a confrontation, it lasted roughly 45 seconds, though it felt far longer. Then Patton lowered the pistol, returned it to its holster, and said, "Get out of my headquarters. Get out of France. Go back to Montgomery and tell him that if I ever catch another British liaison officer spying on American operations, I won't threaten to shoot him. I'll do it and deal with the diplomatic consequences afterward." Thornton Price neither saluted nor spoke. He turned and left at something between a brisk walk and a run. Within 2 hours, he was on a plane back to 21st Army Group headquarters, carrying a story that would ignite an immediate crisis. Montgomery's reaction to Thornton Price's report was fury, anger at what he saw as Patton's outrageous theatrics, and outrage that an American general had threatened a British officer. He sent a formal complaint to Eisenhower demanding that Patton be disciplined for threatening Allied personnel and conduct unbecoming. When Churchill was informed, he was equally incensed. The incident seemed to confirm every British fear about undisciplined American generals, reckless cowboys who could not be trusted to follow protocol. Eisenhower's response, however, stunned everyone. After hearing both sides and reviewing the intercepted transmission, Ike's reply to Montgomery was blunt and devastating. If Montgomery wanted Patton disciplined for threatening a liaison officer, then Eisenhower would also have to discipline Montgomery for using liaison officers as intelligence assets to manipulate Allied operational decisions. And, Eisenhower added, he doubted either of them wanted such an investigation to take place. Through his own inquiries, Eisenhower had learned that Thornton Price was not an isolated case. Montgomery had placed liaison officers with multiple American units, giving them explicit instructions to report on supply conditions, so he could use that information to argue for supply priority during the ongoing dispute over whether the Allies should pursue a broad front strategy. At the heart of the dispute was a fundamental strategic divide. Eisenhower favored a broad approach, supporting both British and American advances across the front. Montgomery, by contrast, believed victory required concentrating resources on his northern thrust alone. The liaison officers he deployed became tools in that struggle. In practice, they were conducting a form of economic espionage against Allied partners, collecting data on American capabilities, and using it to argue that U.S. forces did not require the resources Montgomery wanted for himself. Patton was simply the first American commander to uncover the scheme and call it by its name. The confrontation left Eisenhower trapped between impossible choices. He could not publicly admit that British officers had been spying on American units without shattering Allied unity and handing the Germans a propaganda gift. Yet he also could not punish Patton for threatening Thornton Price, because Patton's outrage was justified, even if the way he expressed it was dangerously inappropriate. Eisenhower's solution was quiet and surgical. All British liaison officers were withdrawn from American units. They were replaced by American liaison officers assigned to British formations, operating under strict orders that prohibited intelligence gathering. At the same time, Eisenhower issued a directive stating that all future supply allocations will be determined at SHEF level, based solely on operational requirements rather than reports submitted by liaison personnel. Montgomery never issued a public apology. Instead, he sent Patton a private letter, less an apology than a justification. He argued that liaison reporting was standard practice, that transparency strengthened alliances, and that tensions had likely been exacerbated by the stresses of ongoing operations. Patton's reply, preserved in his personal papers, was characteristically blunt. He wrote that Montgomery's liaison officer had been a spy, that transparency amounted to theft, and that Montgomery's remark about heightened sensitivities showed he still failed to grasp how close Patton had come to actually shooting the son of the bitch. He added that next time, he would not stop at threats. Whatever remained of the relationship between the two generals did not survive the Thornton Price incident. Already strained by clashing personalities and incompatible strategies, their mutual hostility deepened and continued to complicate Allied operations for the remainder of the war. The broader consequences were even more significant. The episode revealed how intense competition for resources was driving Allied partners toward behavior that closely resembled espionage against one another. Montgomery genuinely believed that concentrating supplies on his northern offensive offered the fastest path to victory. From his perspective, gathering intelligence on American supply conditions was simply prudent planning. From Patton's perspective and that of many American commanders, it was a covert effort to siphon resources away from forces that were advancing faster and achieving better results. The fact that this intelligence gathering was conducted through liaison officers rather than acknowledged spies made it feel more offensive, not less. The fuel crisis that sparked the confrontation never truly resolved. Operation Market Garden collapsed disastrously in late September 1944, demonstrating that Montgomery's strategy had been flawed regardless of how many resources were diverted to it. Patton's Third Army remained chronically short of fuel throughout October and November, unable to exploit opportunities that might have shortened the war. When the Germans launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes in December, the Battle of the Bulge, many historians later argued that a properly supplied Third Army in September and October might have been positioned to prevent or at least blunt the attack. Whether Montgomery's prioritization of resources ultimately cost the Allies months of fighting and thousands of lives remains debated. What is not disputed is that the espionage scandal exposed deep fractures within the Allied command, fractures that never fully healed. Major Richard Thornton Price survived the war, returned to Britain, and never spoke publicly about his encounter with Patton. His official military record simply notes that he was reassigned from liaison duties in September 1944, with no explanation. Patton himself faced no disciplinary action. Eisenhower quietly buried the incident, concluding that preserving Allied unity required pretending it had never occurred, even as he implemented reforms to ensure it could not happen again. The intercepted transmission that triggered the crisis remained classified for decades. When it was finally declassified in the 1990s, it confirmed the account Patton's staff had been sharing privately since the war. Ultimately, the story of why Patton threatened to shoot a British liaison officer is a story about trust, or the absence of it, in coalition warfare. Montgomery was not wrong to argue that Market Garden required resources. Patton was not wrong to insist that Third Army was delivering better results per gallon of fuel consumed. Eisenhower was not wrong to struggle to balance two commanders who both had defensible positions. What poisoned the situation was the method. Had Montgomery openly argued that his operation deserved priority, it would have remained a strategic debate. Instead, he relied on covert intelligence gathering to weaken Patton's case. Once that was exposed, a disagreement over strategy became something far closer to betrayal. If this account of espionage, rivalry, and a general nearly shooting an Allied officer changes how you view World War II, it raises uncomfortable questions. Allies do not always trust one another. Sometimes the most dangerous conflicts are not with the enemy across the lines, but within the command structures meant to fight them.